Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really significant topic, decolonization after 1900.
Yeah, it's a period of massive global shifts.
Absolutely. And we know you want to get a solid grasp of how different nations moved away from colonial rule and, well, understand it thoroughly and efficiently.
So we've dug into the historical analysis, looking at the key patterns and processes.
We're focusing on how various peoples actually pursued independence, drawing on what the sources tell us.
And two main paths really stand out, don't they? Negotiated independence
Right.
and independence achieved through armed struggle.
And we also have to talk about the lasting impact of those colonial borders that were drawn, often quite arbitrarily.
Definitely. That's a crucial piece of the puzzle. So the goal today is really to compare these different independence processes after 1900.
Okay, let's dive into that first path then. Negotiated independence. India feels like the obvious starting point, doesn't it? The jewel in the crown of the British Empire.
It really was hugely valuable, Britain's most prosperous colony by far.
And the British did invest there, infrastructure-wise. Railroads, ports.
They did, yeah. Railroads, seaports, some urban development. But, the sources are pretty clear this was primarily for British benefit.
Right, like getting raw materials out efficiently.
Exactly. Transporting goods to ports for export. It wasn't really designed around the needs of the Indian people or internal trade so much.
But that modernization, it had unintended consequences, didn't it? Like fostering an educated middle class.
It did. And that class became increasingly influenced by nationalism, this idea of self-rule.
Which led to things like the Indian National Congress back in 1885.
Formed in 1885. Initially, their aim was, well, more moderate. They wanted to petition the British for a bigger voice within the system.
But the British weren't really listening.
Pretty much ignored, yeah. Which understandably pushed the movement towards demanding more.
Then World War I happens. Millions of Indian soldiers fight for Britain.
With the expectation, or at least the hope, of greater self-rule afterwards.
Which also didn't materialize.
No. Those hopes were dashed. And that really fueled the discontent. Then you have the Amritsar massacre.
God, yeah, a real turning point. British troops firing on peaceful protesters, just horrific.
Absolutely horrific. It galvanized the independence movement like never before, just amplified everything.
And this is when Mohandas Gandhi really comes to the forefront, right? With nonviolent resistance.
His leadership was absolutely crucial. Nonviolent resistance became the defining strategy.
Did the British respond at all before the end?
Well, in the 1920s, there was some limited transfer of authority, some small concessions. But it was, nowhere near independence.
Then comes World War II. India gets drawn in again.
Millions more soldiers involved. And afterwards, the demands for independence were just undeniable, louder than ever.
And Britain's situation had changed too by then.
Dramatically. War fatigue was immense. Britain was economically drained. Plus, politically, the mood had shifted. More politicians in London were actually pro-independence, or at least saw it as inevitable.
So 1947, Britain grants independence. Negotiated, yes, but after decades of struggle.
Decades of pressure, campaigning, sacrifice. It shows how that internal pressure combined with the changing external reality for the imperial power can eventually lead to a negotiated outcome. But rarely easy or quick.
Okay, let's look at another British example. The Gold Coast.
Yes, the Gold Coast. Think Kwame Nkrumah, the United Gold Coast Convention, the UGCC, formed in 1947.
So, similar timing in terms of post-war movements. Parallels with India.
Definitely some parallels in the negotiation aspect. Nkrumah and the UGCC engaged with the British. And again, wider factors were at play.
Like what?
Well, post-war, support for imperialism was waning back in Britain. People were questioning the costs, the morality, and the sheer expense of rebuilding Britain meant colonies seemed less affordable, less essential.
So that mix of internal push and external factors leads to Ghana in 1957, another negotiated independence.
Exactly. Now, what about the French Empire? French West Africa.
That was a huge area, right? Senegal, Ivory Coast.
Senegal, Ivory Coast, Niger, many others. The French had been there since the 1800s, often ruling with relatively small occupational forces.
How do they manage that?
They relied quite heavily on cooperation, on working with local governments and traditional chiefs. It was perhaps a less direct approach in some ways than British rule in India.
Interesting. But that couldn't last forever.
No. As nationalist movements grew and those cooperative relationships frayed, France realized that maintaining control would require a much bigger commitment of resources troops money.
Resources they weren't willing or maybe able to commit after the war.
Precisely. So for most of French West Africa, they also moved towards negotiated independence, largely completed by 1959.
Okay, so we've covered negotiated paths. But that wasn't the only way, was it? Our sources point to a much more violent route, too.
Absolutely. Independence through armed conflict. And a key factor, often the deciding factor, seems to be the size of the white European settler population.
How so?
Well, where you had large numbers of European settlers who saw the colony as their permanent home, who had deep roots and economic interests there, they tended to fiercely resist any move towards independence for the indigenous population.
Which inevitably led to conflict.
Often very brutal conflict. Algeria is maybe the starkest example under French rule.
Right, because France also controlled Morocco and Tunisia nearby, and they got independence relatively peacefully, didn't they?
They did, largely without widespread bloodshed. Algeria was different.
Why? What made it different?
Between roughly 1750 and 1900, there had been significant French migration to Algeria, hundreds of thousands of settlers, the Pinois. They saw Algeria not just as a colony, but as an integral part of France itself.
And they weren't going to give that up easily.
Not at all. They aggressively resisted any talk of Algerian independence.
So how did Algerians push back?
In 1954, the National Liberation Front, the FLN, was formed by Arab and Berber Muslims. They launched an armed struggle attacks on French military, police, even civilian targets associated with the colonial regime.
And that kicked off the Algerian War.
A truly vicious war, characterized by extreme violence, guerrilla warfare, bombings.
And the French response was also brutal, wasn't it? Our sources mention widespread human rights abuses.
Yes, the French military response was incredibly harsh. Torture, collective punishment, massacres of civilians, it was documented. The war was tearing France apart, too, politically and socially.
Until de Gaulle stepped in.
Eventually, yes. President Charles de Gaulle recognized the war was unwinnable, or at least the cost was too high. He opened negotiations with the FLN in 1962, leading to Algeria's independence, but only after immense bloodshed.
A terrible price for freedom. What about Angola? That was Portuguese.
Yes, Angola, another protracted and bloody conflict, the Angolan War of Independence.
How did that start?
In the 1950s, you had three main Angolan political groups forming to oppose Portuguese rule. The spark for widespread violence came after a protest against the really inhumane treatment of Angolan farmers by the colonial authorities.
And it's escalated quickly from there.
Very quickly into a full-blown war. Again, brutal tactics on both sides.
Was either side winning?
Not really. It became a long, grinding stalemate. The Portuguese army couldn't definitively crush the liberation movements, but the movements couldn't force the Portuguese out either.
So what broke the deadlock?
An event in Portugal itself, actually. The Carnation Revolution, a military coup in 1974, overthrew the dictatorship in Lisbon. The new government wanted out of the costly colonial wars.
Ah, so that created the opening.
Exactly. Negotiations started, and Angola finally achieved independence in 1975.
But like you said, the end of colonial rule doesn't always mean peace, right?
Tragically not in Angola's case. The three rival liberation movements, which had sort of united against Portugal, immediately turned on each other.
The Civil War.
A devastating civil war, yeah. Each group represented different ethnic bases and had different external backers. It became a major proxy war in the Cold War.
No, so the U.S. and Soviets backing different sides.
Right. Pouring in weapons, money, prolonging the conflict, increasing the suffering. It's a grim reminder that independence itself doesn't solve underlying divisions, especially when external powers get involved.
Sobering. Okay, let's shift to Vietnam. Another French colony, another war.
Vietnam, or Indochina as it was known then. A complex situation after World War II. The Japanese had pushed the French out during the war.
Right.
But after Japan's defeat, France tried to come back and reassert control, especially in the south.
But in the north.
In the north, you had Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh establishing a communist government. Their goal was clear: kick the French out completely and unite all of Vietnam under communism.
Which led straight to conflict.
Led directly to the First Indochina War, fought from 1946 to 1954, French versus Viet Minh.
And the result?
French defeat at Dien Bien Phu and the Geneva Accords, which temporarily divided Vietnam into North and South.
A division that became permanent and led to, well, the Vietnam War.
Precisely. That partition set the stage for the much larger Vietnam War, another massive Cold War proxy conflict with devastating consequences.
We should probably briefly mention Egypt, too. It's kind of a unique case.
Yeah, a bit of a hybrid, technically independent from Britain since 1922, but
But British troops stayed around the Suez Canal.
Exactly. Britain kept troops there to protect its strategic interests, primarily the canal. Real independence was limited.
Until Nasser.
Until General Gamal Abdel Nasser led the coup that overthrew the monarchy after World War II, establishing the Republic of Egypt. He was a strong nationalist.
And he nationalized the Suez Canal, right? That caused a huge international incident.
It certainly did. For Nasser, the canal, controlled by a French-British company with British troops nearby, was a symbol of lingering colonialism. Nationalizing it in 1956 was a bold anti-colonial move.
Which triggered the Suez Crisis. Britain, France, Israel invading.
They did, yeah. A coordinated, secret plan to seize the canal back. It failed spectacularly, politically at least, due to U.S. and Soviet pressure. But it showed the high stakes involved in challenging residual colonial power.
Okay, so we've seen negotiation, we've seen armed conflict, but there's this other massive issue running through all of this, the problem of those colonial boundaries.
Absolutely crucial. How those imperial borders were drawn, often between 1750 and 1900, is key to understanding so much post-independence conflict.
Because they were drawn with little regard for who actually lived there. Ethnic groups, religions.
Exactly. Drawn for European convenience, resource access, or agreements between colonial powers, they paid little or no attention to existing ethnic, linguistic, or religious realities on the ground.
So you end up forcing rival groups together in one country.
Or splitting existing communities across new artificial borders.
Which sounds like a recipe for disaster once the colonial power leaves.
It often was. It laid the groundwork for power struggles, discrimination, secession movements, civil wars. The partition of British India is probably the most devastating example.
Even though India's independence was negotiated at the top level.
Yes, but the implementation, the drawing of that border between India and Pakistan was catastrophic.
Why Pakistan?
Well, India had a very large Muslim minority population who'd been there since, well, the 1200s onwards. During the independence talks, the Muslim League, fearing marginalization in a Hindu-majority India, demanded a separate state.
And they got it, Pakistan.
Yes, Pakistan was created as a homeland for Muslims carved out of British India. But the partition line went through ethnically mixed areas, particularly Punjab and Bengal.
Leading to those horrific mass migrations.
Unbelievable chaos and violence. Millions displaced. Hindus and Sikhs moving south to India, Muslims moving north to Pakistan. Estimates vary, but hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million people, were killed in the communal violence.
Just staggering. A direct consequence of imposing that border.
Directly linked to how the partition was handled, yes. Now, it's not always immediate post-independence civil war. Look at Canada, for instance.
The Quebecois separatist movement.
Exactly. Its roots are deep in the colonial history, the division between French and British Canada. It's about preserving French language, culture, identity within a predominantly Anglophone country.
It's been a long-running issue.
Very long. It really gained steam during Quebec's Quiet Revolution in the 60s and 70s, a period of intense social and political change.
And sometimes it turned violent, didn't it? The FLQ.
Yes, the Front de Libération de Quebec used bombings and kidnappings in the 60s and early 70s, culminating in the October Crisis of 1970, which led to the Canadian government invoking the War Measures Act. Pretty extreme stuff.
But mostly it's been political since then.
Mostly, yes.
Yeah.
Including 2 referendums on Quebec independence, one in 1980 and one in 1995. Both failed, but the 1995 one was incredibly close. It shows those tensions stemming from historical divisions are still there.
And finally, Nigeria. Another example of borders causing trouble.
Definitely. Nigeria got negotiated independence from Britain in 1960. But it's a huge country, artificially created by combining very different regions and peoples.
And conflict erupted pretty quickly.
Yes, the Nigerian Civil War began in 1967. It stemmed from power struggles between different ethnic and regional groups.
This was the Biafra War.
That's right. The Igbo people, mainly in the southeast, who were often Christian and had maybe adapted more readily to Western education under the British, felt marginalized and threatened after coups and counter-coups. They tried to secede and form their own country, Biafra.
But the Nigerian government fought to prevent that.
Fiercely. Not least because the Biafran region was where most of Nigeria's oil reserves were located. Oil was and is crucial to Nigeria's economy.
So economics played a big role.
A huge role.
Yeah.
The war was incredibly brutal, lots of suffering, famine. The federal government eventually won in 1970, and Nigeria remained united.
But the tensions didn't just disappear.
No. Those underlying issues, many stemming from how the country was put together by the British, continue to cause friction in Nigeria. And frankly, in many other parts of Africa and the world where colonial borders created similar problems.
So, wrapping this up, it seems clear there were these two broad paths after 1900 negotiation, often influenced by the colonizers' changing circumstances.
And armed conflict, frequently driven by settler resistance to losing power and privilege.
And layered over all of that is this persistent, difficult legacy of the borders themselves.
Yeah, those arbitrarily drawn lines, creating nations where maybe none existed before, dividing peoples who belong together. It's been a major source of instability and conflict right up to the present day.
It really underscores how these events from the 20th century are still shaping our world, influencing current events and conflicts.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe, for our listeners.
Mhm.
Thinking about these examples India, Algeria, Vietnam, Nigeria, even Quebec where do you see echoes of these same factors, these same struggles over self determination, borders, and identity playing out in the world today?
Hmm, that's definitely something to consider. There's certainly more to explore in all the specific regions and histories we've touched on.